The bullets came before she heard the door open. That's the part nobody tells you about violence. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't give you time to pray or run or think. One second, Maren Holloway was refilling a stranger's coffee cup at 3:14 in the morning. And the next second, that stranger was bleeding out across the counter with three professional killers standing in the doorway of her diner, guns already raised, eyes already cold. They looked at her and smiled. They thought she was nothing. They were wrong about that, dead wrong. If you've ever been underestimated, if you've ever been invisible to people who should have known better, this story is going to hit different. Subscribe right now and follow Maren's story all the way to the end, because I promise you, you have never seen a character like this before. Hit that like button, drop a comment telling me your city and country. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to that diner. Let's go back to 3:14 a.m., because that's where everything changed. The Silver Lantern Diner had been dying slowly for 11 years. You could see it in the parking lot. Cracked asphalt split open by weeds pushing through like the earth itself had given up trying to hold the place together. You could see it in the neon sign above the entrance. The letter L, in lantern, blinking its distress signal into the wet October night. On off, like a pulse that couldn't quite decide whether to keep going. The front windows were fogged from the inside, smeared with the kind of grease that no amount of cleaning ever fully removed, only moved around. The vinyl booths had been patched so many times with mismatched electrical tape that the repairs had become their own kind of design. Brown tape over red vinyl, black tape over brown tape, silver tape over everything. The ceiling tiles above the counter had gone yellow from decades of accumulated smoke and steam, and the industrial coffee machine behind the counter made a sound every 40 minutes like a man clearing his throat before delivering bad news. Nobody came to the Silver Lantern for the ambiance. They came because it was open, because it was cheap, because at 3 a.m. in the crumbling east side of the city, there weren't many other options for the kind of people who found themselves awake at 3 a.m. The insomniacs and the drifters, the long-haul truckers and the night shift nurses, the quiet men nursing bourbon they'd smuggled in under their jackets, the occasional couple having the kind of argument that needed a public setting to stay civil. Maren Holloway had been serving all of them for 6 years. She was 28 years old, and she looked younger, which people consistently used against her without realizing they were doing it. Small bones, slight frame, dark hair she kept pinned back in a way that left a few strands loose around her face. Not by design, just because keeping every strand pinned took more attention than she had to spare during a 10-hour overnight shift. She moved through the diner with the economy of someone who had learned to do more with less, carrying 3 plates on one arm and a coffee pot in the other hand without making it look like a performance. When customers talked over her, which they did constantly, she didn't fight it. When her manager, a heavyset man named Gus, who smelled of onions and talked exclusively about his ex-wife, shorted her on hours or forgot to add her tips to her check, she mentioned it once and then let it go. People saw a quiet girl who didn't make waves. They didn't see much else. That was their mistake, though none of them would ever know it, because none of them were around on the night it became relevant. Tonight, the diner had gone quiet around 2:30, which was normal. The last trucker had settled his bill and rumbled back out to the highway. The insomniac couple in booth 7, regulars Maren privately called the sad accountant and the woman who deserved better, had drifted out around 2, their argument concluded or suspended, she could never tell which. By 3 o'clock, only 2 customers remained, an older man with paint-stained hands asleep over his decaf at the counter, and a booth in the back corner occupied by a man Maren had never seen before. She'd noticed him when he came in around midnight. You learned, working overnights in a diner like this, to read the room fast. You developed a taxonomy of late-night strangers. Which ones were harmless? Which ones were volatile? Which ones were going to order nothing and sit for 4 hours? This man didn't fit any category she had. He was somewhere in his mid-40s, built broad through the shoulders in a way that a good suit tried to soften and didn't fully succeed. His hands were wrong for the suit, thick, scarred at the knuckles, the hands of someone who had used them differently than a man in a $3,000 jacket was supposed to use his hands. He sat with his back to the wall and his eyes on the door, and he'd ordered a black coffee and a piece of apple pie, and he'd eaten exactly 2 bites of the pie and left the coffee untouched. "You want to warm up on that?" Maren had asked him around 1:30, gesturing at the cup. No. Pie's good tonight, baked fresh. I'm sure. He hadn't been rude about it. He just wasn't there for the coffee or the pie. She'd figured him for a man waiting on someone who wasn't coming, the way certain people ran from their own bedrooms in the middle of the night and ended up in places like this because they needed walls around them that weren't their own walls. She'd left him alone after that, which was the thing people in distress usually needed most. His name was Dante Caruso. She didn't know that yet. She found out a few minutes after 3 when the door to the Silver Lantern opened and the 3 men walked in, and the man in the expensive suit reached under his jacket with one of those wrong, scarred hands and came out with a pistol, and the first shot took him high in the left shoulder and spun him sideways out of the booth before he could get around off. Marin heard the shot the way you hear a car backfire, a half-second delay between the sound and your brain deciding what the sound actually was. She was behind the counter, reaching for the coffee pot when it registered. She straightened up, and her eyes went to the booth in the corner, and the man was on the floor between the table and the wall, his suit jacket going dark at the shoulder, his gun on the floor 3 feet from his reaching hand. She looked at the 3 men by the door. They were professionals. She could see it in how they moved, controlled, spaced apart so they couldn't be taken with one sweep, their weapons already up and tracking. 2 of them were moving along the wall toward the injured man. The third one, the smallest of them with a face like something that had been broken and reset slightly wrong, was looking at her. "Hey!" His voice was almost friendly. "You're going to want to stay very still." The man with the paint-stained hands who'd been asleep at the counter was already awake, already off his stool, already through the kitchen door. Marin didn't blame him. She would have done the same thing if her legs had been willing to move. They weren't. She stood behind the counter with the coffee pot in her right hand and watched the 2 men reach the injured man's booth and haul him halfway upright. And she watched the injured man's face, Dante Caruso's face, though she still didn't know that, go through the specific expression of someone doing a calculation with bad numbers. He was hurt badly enough that fighting was going to be difficult. He was cornered badly enough that running was probably not possible. His gun was on the floor, and the boot of the smaller man, the one watching Marin, was coming down on it now. The smaller man looked at her and smiled. "There, a back way out of this place, sweetheart." The word landed on her the way it always did. Not like an insult exactly, but like a door being closed, an assessment. He was asking her a logistical question, but what he was really saying was that he'd already decided she wasn't a threat. The slight frame, the coffee pot, the diner uniform with the small tear at the left shoulder that she kept forgetting to sew. He'd looked at her and done his own calculation and come up with 0. She thought about lying. She thought about screaming. She thought about the back door that led through the kitchen and out to the alley where the dumpsters were. And she thought about running through it while whatever was about to happen to the man in the booth happened without her. None of those thoughts lasted more than a second. What lasted was something older and quieter than thought, something she hadn't called on in years since the winter she was 17, and her father had started taking her to the range because he said he couldn't always be there, and she needed to know what to do when she was alone and something went wrong. He'd been dead for 4 years, and she hadn't fired a gun since the week before the funeral. But the muscle memory didn't care about timelines. The muscle memory was already running its own math. 3 men, 2 guns she could see, probably 3. The injured man's pistol on the floor under the smaller man's boot. Distance from the counter to the booth, 22 feet. Distance from the counter to the kitchen door behind her, 4 steps. She set the coffee pot down carefully. "There's a back door," she said. "Through the kitchen." The smaller man nodded like she'd confirmed something he already suspected. He looked away from her, looked back toward his partners and the injured man they were wrestling upright. And in that 3-second window of not being watched, Marin's hand found the button under the counter that killed all the lights in the front of the house. The diner went dark. Not completely dark. The blinking neon sign outside threw red light through the fogged windows in irregular pulses, turning the interior into something strobed and strange, geometry made unreliable, distance hard to judge. She heard one of the men by the booth swear. She heard the smaller man say something sharp and flat that she didn't catch because she was already moving, already low, already past the end of the counter and going left along the floor toward the booth, using the darkness the way her father had taught her to use cover, not as a hiding place but as a tool. She heard the shot before she understood what she was doing. They were shooting at the place she'd been, not the place she was. That was something. That meant they'd been surprised, and surprised men shot at memories. She reached the booth, the corner booth, the man's booth, and her hand found the pistol on the floor in the dark, and the pistol was heavier than she remembered from all those years at the range, a different weight than her father's old target gun, but a weight she recognized in the abstract way you recognize a language you studied once and mostly forgot. Her fingers wrapped around the grip. From the floor of the Silver Lantern Diner, 22 feet from where she'd been standing 30 seconds ago, Marin Holloway chambered around. One of the killers swept his weapon light across the room, and the beam caught her face for half a second before she rolled sideways behind the booth space. She heard the smaller man say, "Oh, there she is." She heard the laughter in his voice. She heard the footsteps moving toward her. She pressed her back against the base of the booth and felt the cold linoleum against her spine, and she made herself breathe. Slow, measured, the way her father had stood behind her in the cold November air of the range and said, "Lower your shoulders, slow your breathing. Your body doesn't know the difference between panic and focus unless you teach it." And she listened to the footsteps getting closer in the dark. 12 feet, 10, 8. She heard Dante Caruso hit the floor again. One of the men holding him had lost his grip in the confusion, and she heard the sound of the injured man trying to get purchase, trying to use the booth frame to pull himself up, failing, and one of the men saying, "Get him up." And the man himself making no sound at all, except the wet, controlled breathing of someone who had been hurt badly and was refusing to acknowledge it. The footsteps stopped at 6 feet. She could feel the smaller man's presence in the dark the way you feel weather changing, a pressure shift, an attention like a physical thing. He was patient. He was waiting for his eyes to adjust, or for her to move, or for one of his partners to bring a light around. Marin stopped waiting for any of them to do anything. She came up from behind the booth fast, left hand on the seat back for leverage, weapon already raised, and in the red pulse of the broken neon she found the shape of him. 3 feet closer than she'd thought, his gun coming up slower than hers because she was already moving and he was still reacting. And she pulled the trigger once. The sound in the enclosed space of the diner was enormous. She felt it in her back teeth. He went down sideways against the neighboring booth, and she was already moving again, already cutting right toward the kitchen door because the other two were going to orient on the muzzle flash, and she could not be in the same place twice. And that was the only rule that mattered right now, the only thing her brain could hold on to: never be where they think you are. She hit the kitchen door with her shoulder, and it swung open, and the fluorescent light of the kitchen was blinding after the dark of the dining room, and she pressed herself flat against the wall inside and sucked air through her nose and tried to count what she knew. 1 down. Maybe down. She hadn't stopped to confirm. 2 still standing, one of them managing a wounded man, the other free. Her hands were shaking. She noticed this the way you notice a small tear in fabric, clinically, at a distance, as something to address later. She pressed her palms flat against the stainless steel of the prep table and breathed. The kitchen was narrow and long, running the full depth of the diner. The dumpster exit at the far end. The pass-through window to the dining room to her left, currently closed. The industrial range to her right, a pot of coffee sitting on the burner from the last batch she'd made 2 hours ago, still warm, steam wisping from the surface. The spice rack above the range. The stack of cast iron pans on the lower shelf. She looked at the coffee pot. She looked at the closed door back to the dining room. She heard boots on the dining room floor. Heavy, deliberate, not trying to be quiet anymore. And she understood that the calculation had shifted. Before, she'd been a witness they needed to manage. Now she was something else. Now she was a variable they needed to eliminate. The footsteps stopped just outside the kitchen door. She picked up the coffee pot. The door swung open, and Marin Holloway, quiet and unnoticed and catastrophically underestimated, swung the pot of scalding coffee in a wide arc toward the face of the man coming through the door, and the night was nowhere near over, and neither was she. The coffee hit him full in the face, not warm coffee, not lukewarm coffee that had been sitting too long and lost its danger. The pot had been on the burner for 2 hours at a low simmer, and the liquid inside was still close to 200 degrees. And when Marin swung it in that wide, desperate arc, and the contents caught the man coming through the kitchen door across the bridge of his nose and both cheekbones, The sound he made was not a scream exactly. It was something that came before screaming, something raw and animal that the human throat produces when the nervous system receives information it cannot immediately process. He dropped his gun. That was the thing she remembered afterward. Not the sound he made, not the way he clawed at his own face, but the gun hitting the linoleum and spinning away toward the base of the industrial range, and her body already moving toward it before her mind had caught up with what her body was doing. She got to the gun on her knees, sliding the last 18 inches on the slick floor, and her left hand closed around it while her right hand still held the pistol she'd taken off the floor of the dining room. She came up with both weapons, and her back hit the lower cabinet beneath the prep table, and she sat there on the kitchen floor with a gun in each hand, and her heart doing something that didn't have a name, something between terror and a kind of cold, electrical focus she had never felt before in her life. The man with the scalded face was against the opposite wall, both hands pressed to his skin, making short, hitching sounds. His weapon was hers now. He was out, 2 down, 1 left standing in the dining room, plus the wounded man, Dante, whoever he was, whose status she still didn't know. She got to her feet. Her knees were shaking, but her hands were steadier than they had any right to be, and she understood dimly that this was what her father had meant all those years ago when he'd said, "The body has its own kind of sense, Marin, and sometimes the only job you have is to get out of its way." She set the second gun on the prep table and kept the first one, the one she'd fired before, the one she'd already chambered and understood the trigger weight on, even just from that one shot. 2 guns were 2 problems. 1 gun she could manage. She moved to the pass-through window and eased it open an inch and looked through into the dining room. The neon was still pulsing. Red light, darkness, red light, darkness. In one of the red pulses she saw the third man, the one who'd been holding Dante, the larger of the 2, built like a man who'd spent serious time moving serious weight, crouched behind the counter near the register, his weapon raised, his eyes cutting between the kitchen door and something she couldn't see at the far left edge of the dining room. She shifted the angle of her view, and in the next red pulse she found Dante. He was alive. He'd made it to the corner booth and pulled himself up into a sitting position against the wall, his injured shoulder pressed to the vinyl to slow the bleeding, his face the color of old concrete. His eyes were open, and they were tracking the man behind the counter with a steadiness that struck Marin as slightly insane for a person who'd been shot 20 minutes ago. He had nothing in his hands. He was pinned. He was doing the same math she was doing and coming up with numbers he didn't like. His eyes moved to the pass-through window, found hers. She expected surprise. Instead, she got a slight tightening around his eyes, an adjustment, the look of a man incorporating new information and updating his position. He looked at the man behind the counter. He looked back at her. He moved his chin, barely, maybe a quarter inch, to the left. She didn't understand it immediately, then she did. He was telling her where the man couldn't see. The angle behind the counter was a blind spot. If she came through the kitchen door low and cut left along the baseboards, the counter itself would block the man's sightline for almost 15 feet. 15 feet was most of the distance she'd need. After that, she'd be exposed for maybe 3 steps before she had the angle. She looked at Dante Caruso and thought, this man has done this before. Not the getting shot part. The staying alive after the getting shot part. She pulled back from the pass-through and stood in the kitchen and breathed, and did not let herself think about the man with the scalded face still making sounds against the wall behind her, because the moment she let herself hear those sounds as human, she was going to have a problem she couldn't afford to have right now. She looked at the kitchen door. She looked at the pot still on the burner, now empty and starting to scorch slightly at the bottom. She looked at her own hands, 22 feet from her father's first lesson to this moment. The man had died of a cardiac event on a Tuesday morning in February, and she hadn't been there, and she had never stopped being angry about that. And none of that mattered right now, but it was in her anyway. The way old grief is always somewhere in the body, waiting for a quiet moment to surface. This was not a quiet moment. She went through the kitchen door low and fast and cut left. The counter blocked her. She moved along the baseboard in a crouch, her left hand on the floor for balance, the gun in her right hand, and she counted the tiles as she moved because counting gave the brain something to do that wasn't panic. 3 tiles. 5. 8. The scratched chrome base of a bar stool, a wadded napkin, someone's forgotten reading glasses on the floor, one lens cracked. She heard the man behind the counter shift his weight. She stopped, breathing through her nose, mouth closed. The way her father had said, "Your breath is noise, and noise is information you're giving away for free, and nothing in a fight should be free." The man behind the counter was listening too. She could feel it. The quality of the silence changed when someone on the other side of something was actively listening versus just waiting. This man was listening. He'd heard something, or he'd sensed something, the way predators sense pressure changes in the air around them. "Marcus." His voice was low and directed at the kitchen, calling for the man she'd put down with the coffee. "Marcus, answer me." Nothing from the kitchen. A pause. Then, "Luca," calling for the smaller man she'd shot in the dining room. Nothing. Another pause, longer this time. "Well," his voice had changed. The flat professional calm was still there, but underneath it something else had crept in. Not fear exactly, but its functional cousin, the thing that happens when a professional realizes the situation has moved outside the parameters they planned for. "Okay then." She heard him stand up from behind the counter. She came around the end of the counter at the same moment, and they were 6 feet apart, and both their weapons came up, and for one stuttering second neither of them fired because the proximity was wrong. The distance was too close for the hesitation that comes before a trigger pull, and in that second she saw his face clearly for the first time. Older than she'd expected, late 40s, early 50s, a face that had been good-looking once and had been worked over by years and weather into something harder and less forgiving. A small scar through the left eyebrow, eyes that were doing exactly what her eyes were doing, running the numbers, measuring the geometry, calculating the odds. "You're the waitress," he said. "Yeah." "You took out Marcus and Luca." "Marcus is down. Luca I'm not sure about." Something moved through his face. Not admiration, more like a recalibration. "You're not a waitress." "I am, actually." "Nobody just—" He stopped, reconsidered. "Who sent you?" "Nobody sent me. I work here." "You work here." He said it the way you repeat something that doesn't parse in the language you're used to. "You're telling me you work here and You came into my diner," Marin said. "You started shooting." The gun in her hand was not shaking. She was aware of this in the detached way she'd been aware of the shaking in her knees earlier, as data, as something to note and account for. The gun was not shaking because her arm was braced properly, and she'd found her breath and her father was dead 4 years, and she would grieve that in full at a later time. "This doesn't have to go further," the man said. "Walk out the back. Forget everything you saw tonight." "And him?" She didn't move her eyes from the man's face, but she was aware of Dante in the booth at the edge of her peripheral vision, still upright, still watching. "He's not your problem." "He's in my diner. That makes him my problem." The man's jaw tightened. "You don't know who you're protecting. I don't know who you're working for either. We're both in the dark. I'm giving you a way out." "I noticed." She kept her voice flat, kept her breathing even, kept the front sight on the center of his chest. "I'm not taking it." What happened then was fast and close and ugly. He made a decision she could read in the micro shift of his shoulder, half a second before his trigger finger moved, and she threw herself sideways toward the counter while the shot went into the wall behind where she'd been standing. She hit the counter edge with her ribs, hard, the kind of impact that makes the lungs empty all at once. And the gun in her hand went off when she hit, not aimed, just fired from the shock of impact, and she heard him grunt. She got behind the counter and pressed her back against the lower cabinets and couldn't breathe for a moment, fully couldn't breathe, the ribs screaming and her lungs flat and empty and her body running on the oxygen already in her blood while she waited for the ability to inhale to return. It came back in a rush. She gasped, loud, uncontrolled, the opposite of everything her father had said about breath. And she came up over the counter with the gun, and the man was down on one knee by the register, his left hand pressed to his side, his weapon still up. They looked at each other. "You shot me," he said. He sounded less surprised than the sentence implied. "I didn't mean to." She hadn't. The shot had been accidental. She chose not to examine what that said about her, that it had still connected. Where'd you learn to shoot? My father. Your father teach you to take cover properly, too. He taught me a lot of things. The man's weapon arm was lowering. Not because he was surrendering, yeah, she could see it wasn't that. It was lowering because the strength was going out of it. The body making executive decisions the mind wasn't fully on board with yet. He was losing blood faster than he'd calculated. The shot had gone somewhere it shouldn't have, clipped something internal that was making its unhappiness known. You should put pressure on that, Marin said. He laughed. It was a short, painful sound. Yeah. I'm not going to shoot you again if you put the gun down. That's supposed to make me feel better? It's supposed to be practical. He looked at her for a long moment. His weapon arm finished its descent, and the gun came to rest on the floor beside his knee, and he put both hands against his side and leaned against the base of the counter, and the fight went out of him the way heat goes out of a room when a window breaks. All at once, completely, without ceremony. Marin came around the counter carefully. She kicked the gun away from his reach. She crouched and looked at the wound, and the wound was bad. Not immediately fatal, but progressing in that direction without intervention. She looked around the diner at the wreckage of the last 40 minutes, at the booths with their bullet holes and the shattered coffee mugs on the floor, and the dark spreading from the place the first man had been hit when he walked in. She stood up and walked to the corner booth. Dante Caruso looked up at her, and his face was still the color of old concrete, but something had shifted in his eyes. She still didn't know who he was. She still didn't know why 3 professional killers had walked into her diner to put bullets in him. She still didn't know what any of this was going to cost her, or whether the cost was already fixed and she was just waiting to receive the bill. You're still standing, he said. His voice was rough, the words slightly compressed, breathing around the pain. So are you, more or less. More or less. He tried to shift his position and couldn't quite manage it. How many? 3. 1 in the kitchen, 1 by the door, 1 behind the counter. The one behind the counter is going to need a hospital. He won't get one. When she looked at him, he added, That's not a threat. He won't allow it. Men like that don't go to hospitals. Too many questions. Men like what? The kind who do what he was hired to do tonight. She sat down across from him in the booth. Her legs had decided they were done holding her up, and she had no argument ready for them. The vinyl was cool against the backs of her thighs. She put the gun on the table between them and looked at her hands. Who are you? She asked. Dante Caruso. The name landed in the room and just sat there. She turned it over, waited for recognition, found something in a lower register than recognition, more like a vibration, the kind you feel in the floor before you can actually hear the sound. She'd heard the name. She couldn't have said where. The news, maybe, or the way names like that circulated in the margins of a neighborhood without ever being attached to anything specific enough to hold. Should I know who that is? Probably not, but I should be scared. You were already scared tonight, Dante said. Didn't seem to slow you down much. She looked at the gun on the table, looked at the diner around her. Her diner, the place she'd spent 6 years of overnight shifts, the place that smelled like burnt coffee and old grease, and something underneath both of those things that she'd never been able to name, but that felt, in some basic way, like her. The patched vinyl booths, the yellow ceiling tiles, the blinking neon throwing its red pulse through the fogged windows. I have to call the police, she said. No. People are shot. One of them is seriously... No police. His voice didn't rise, it just got heavier. If you call the police, what happened here tonight becomes a case file. A case file has your name in it. Your name in a case file with my name means every person who wanted me dead 20 minutes ago now has a reason to come looking for you too. That's not a threat. It's an explanation. She looked at him steadily. What's the alternative? My people will be here in 11 minutes. Your people. They'll take care of this. The men, the damage. All of it. She looked around again at the damage. Bullet holes in the boots. Broken glass. The man bleeding behind the counter. The man with the scalded face in the kitchen, who had gone quiet in a way that she was refusing to assess right now. And me? She said. Dante was quiet for a moment. She watched him breathe through the shoulder wound, The controlled, metered breathing of a man managing serious pain without medication. His eyes, when they came back to hers, were clear. Whatever she'd expected to find there, gratitude, calculation, the look of a man running angles, wasn't quite what she got. What she got was something more direct than any of that. More like the look of someone seeing a thing clearly for the first time and adjusting everything else around that new fact. "You saved my life," he said. "I was protecting myself." Both things can be true. She looked down at her hands again. There was a small cut on her left palm she hadn't noticed before, probably from the broken glass on the floor when she'd been moving through the dark. It wasn't deep. It had already stopped bleeding. "I want to go home," she said. The words came out smaller than she intended. "After tonight," Dante said, and something in his voice made her look up. "Home is going to mean something different than it did yesterday." "What does that mean?" "It means the man behind the counter is the third attempt on my life in 6 weeks. It means whoever hired them is going to find out 3 more of their people didn't come back. It means they're going to want to know why." He paused. "And when they find out why, they're going to want to know who." The silence stretched between them. Outside the fogged windows, the neon blinked. On, off, on, off. "Nobody knows who I am," Marin said. "They will." "How?" "Because Luca is still breathing. You said you weren't sure about Luca." She felt it before she fully processed it. The wrongness of the silence from the front of the diner. She'd left Luca where he'd gone down by the booth near the door. She'd heard him hit the floor. She hadn't confirmed. She hadn't gone back to check because the other threats were more immediate, and because some part of her hadn't wanted to look too closely at what she'd done. She picked up the gun from the table and stood up from the booth. The front of the diner was empty. The booth by the door where Luca had fallen held nothing but a dark stain on the vinyl seat where he'd slumped against it. The front door was ajar, the cold night air moving through it, carrying the smell of rain and wet concrete. The red neon threw its pulse across the empty floor. Luca was gone. She stood in the middle of the Silver Lantern diner at 4:18 in the morning and looked at the open door and understood with a cold, complete certainty that the world she'd woken up in yesterday was closed to her now. Whatever she'd had before tonight, the invisibility, the ordinary weight of an ordinary life, the particular safety of being no one that anyone cared about, it was gone through that open door with the small man with the broken face who'd smiled at her across the counter like she was furniture. Headlights swept across the fogged windows. Not one set. 3. Dante's voice came from the booth behind her, steady and low. "That's my people." She didn't turn around. She stood at the window and watched 3 black vehicles pull into the cracked parking lot of the Silver Lantern and watched the doors open and watched the men come out, and she understood, in the way that understanding sometimes comes not as a thought, but as a physical sensation in the chest, that the thin membrane between her world and a world she'd never wanted to know had not cracked tonight. It had dissolved entirely. And Luca, bleeding, burned, half blinded by her shot, was somewhere in the city right now with her face in his memory and murder already assembling itself behind his eyes, and there was not one single thing she could do to put that back in the bottle. The first of Dante's men pushed through the diner's front door and looked at her. Looked at the gun in her hand, at the wreckage of the room, at the dried blood on her left palm, and then looked past her at the booth where his boss was sitting and said, "Mr. Caruso, we came as fast as—" "I know," Dante said. "She held them until you got here." The man looked at Marin again. A different kind of looking this time. The kind that goes on a little longer than necessary and files something away. She didn't put the gun down. Not yet. She still hadn't put the gun down. The man who'd come through the door first, the one who'd looked at her the way you look at an equation you weren't expecting to find on the board, was named Reeves. She learned that in the first 2 minutes, not because anyone introduced him, but because the others deferred to him in the small, unconscious ways that people defer to someone who outranks them, stepping slightly aside, waiting a half beat before speaking. Reeves was somewhere north of 40, lean in the way that suggested the leanness was maintained deliberately, with a face that had learned to give away as little as possible, and had practiced that lesson long enough that it was now structural. He wore a dark jacket over a dark shirt, and he moved through the Silver Lantern's wreckage without looking at the damage, only at the people. He looked at Dante first, assessed the shoulder wound with his eyes, didn't comment on it, moved on. Then he looked at Marin. "We need to talk about the one who walked out," he said. "Luca," Dante said from the booth. "We know who he is." Reeves was still looking at Marin. "We need to talk about what he saw." "He saw me," Marin said. "That's what he saw. He saw your face. In this diner, with Mr. Caruso still breathing after he wasn't supposed to be." Reeves paused. The pause had the quality of a calculation being completed. "That's a problem of a specific kind." "I live here," Marin said. "I work here. My name is on the schedule. It's not like my identity is hidden." "Your identity wasn't important before tonight." She understood what he meant. She just didn't want to stand inside the understanding yet, because once she did, there was no comfortable place left to stand. She looked at the open front door. The rain had started while she wasn't paying attention, coming down now in thin diagonals across the parking lot, the headlights of the three vehicles catching it and turning it silver. Somewhere out there in the wet dark, Luca was moving. She didn't know toward what. Two of Reeves's men were already in the kitchen. She could hear them working, efficient, quiet, the sounds of a cleanup operation that had been performed before and would be performed again, the sounds of people for whom this was a category of task rather than an emergency. A third man was crouched by the counter where the third assassin had gone down, doing something she couldn't see from this angle. "Is he alive?" she asked. Meaning the man behind the counter. The one she'd shot by accident. "Does it matter to you?" Reeves asked. She thought about it honestly. "Yes." "He's alive. He won't be talking." She decided not to ask what that meant. She'd already used up her capacity for new information several times over tonight, and she was running on reserves that were starting to show their limits. Dante had gotten himself to his feet. Two of Reeves's men were with him, one on each side, and he was waving them off with his good arm in the irritated way of a man who finds physical assistance insulting regardless of how badly he needs it. He got upright. He stood there for a moment with his jaw set and his eyes moving around the diner, not at the damage, the same way Reeves hadn't looked at the damage, at the geometry, at the positions. Reading the room backward from its current state to reconstruct what had happened, and Marin had the unsettling sense of watching someone understand her evening better than she did, seeing angles she'd moved through on instinct now being mapped and evaluated. "You cut the lights first," he said. It wasn't a question. "The button's under the counter. And then you went for Luca's weapon. It was on the floor. You moved toward the shooting instead of the exit." "The exit was in the same direction as two of them." Dante was quiet for a moment, then, "Your father. What about him?" "He taught you well." "He's dead." "I know." He said it simply, without the reflexive condolences people usually attach to that information, and she found she preferred it this way. Condolences required a response, and she didn't have one to give right now. Reeves had moved away from them and was on a phone at the far end of the diner, his back to the room, his voice too low to catch. She watched him and felt the first real trace of something she hadn't had time for yet tonight. Suspicion. Not of Dante, of the situation, of the way the pieces had assembled themselves around her, the way things were being decided and arranged and managed at a pace that left her no room to think. Dante's medical team arrived 9 minutes later. Two people, a man and a woman, both carrying hard-sided cases, both moving with the same calm efficiency as Reeves's cleanup crew. They went to work on Dante's shoulder at the back booth, and he sat and let them and kept his eyes on Marin across the room. She sat at the counter. She put the gun down on the stool beside her. Her reflection looked back at her from the dark fogged window. Thin face, dark hair coming loose from the pin, something in the eyes she didn't fully recognize. She looked like someone who had made a series of decisions that couldn't be undecided. That was accurate. Reeves came back from his phone call and sat down 2 stools away. He didn't ask permission. He put his forearms on the counter and looked at the same fogged window she was looking at. "Luca Fiore," he said. That's the full name. He's been working freelance contract for 3 years. Before that, he was with the Orvetti organization out of the North Side. I don't know what that means. It means he's connected. It means when he reports back, and he will report back, probably within the hour. The people who hired this job tonight will know they have a loose end. He turned his head and looked at her directly. You're the loose end, Ms. Holloway. I got that. Do you have family? The question landed differently than she expected. Why? Because loose ends sometimes get tied off through the people around them. It's a methodology, effective and persuasive. The counter was cold under her forearms. She could feel the edge of it pressing into her skin, and she pressed back against it deliberately, needing the physical reality of something solid. My mother's in Portland. We don't talk much. Is there a reason for that? That's personal. Everything is personal tonight, Ms. Holloway. I'm asking because I need to know where the vulnerabilities are. She looked at him. She was very tired, and the tiredness was a different kind than the tiredness of a long shift, different in quality, sitting in a different part of the body. Behind the eyes and in the base of the skull and in the tendons of her hands, which had been gripping things too hard for the past hour. You want to know my vulnerabilities so you can protect them, or so you can know what to use? Reeves didn't answer immediately. He wasn't a man who filled silence. Both, he said finally. In that order. She almost laughed. She didn't, but it was close. What happens now? Tonight, you come with us. Mr. Caruso has a secure location. You'll be safer there than here until we locate Fiore. And the diner? He glanced around at it. It'll be restored. That's not what I asked. I asked what happens to it, who runs it, whether it opens tomorrow. We'll arrange. I work here, she said. This is my job. This is the thing I do at 3 a.m. instead of sleeping, and I'm not asking you to explain the criminal infrastructure implications of the evening. I'm asking whether the Silver Lantern opens tomorrow. Reeves looked at her for a moment, and something shifted in his face. Not warmth exactly, but a slight recalibration of the assessment he'd been building since he walked in. There will be a morning crew, he said. The diner will open. Your absence will be covered. She nodded. She picked up the gun. She handed it to him, grip first. He took it without comment and tucked it into his jacket and stood up from the stool. She followed him toward the door and then stopped. She went back behind the counter. She got the coffee pot from the under-counter warmer. The second one, not the one she'd weaponized. And she poured herself a cup and drank it standing there in the wreckage of the Silver Lantern at 4:34 in the morning. She drank the whole cup. Then she put the cup down on the counter, and she went with them. The secure location turned out to be a building in the warehouse district that had been converted into something that was almost but not quite a residence. Too clean and too deliberate to be casual. The furniture expensive but impersonal in the way of a place that's been made livable for purpose rather than comfort. There was a room with a bed that was better than her bed at home, and she didn't sleep in it. She sat in the chair by the window and watched the rain work on the city, and waited for the part where she started shaking, because the shaking was supposed to come. She'd heard enough about adrenaline crash to know it arrived eventually, and she wanted to be sitting down when it did. It came around 6 a.m. Her hands first, then her jaw, then something deeper in the chest that wasn't shaking exactly, but was its neighbor. It lasted about 8 minutes. She pressed her palms flat on her thighs and breathed and waited for it to finish, and it finished. After that, she slept in the chair for 3 hours. When she woke up, Reeves was in the room. He was sitting at the small table near the door, and he had a tablet in front of him and 2 coffees. And the way he was positioned made it clear he'd been there for a while and had no intention of pretending otherwise. There's something you need to see, he said. She straightened in the chair. Her neck hurt from the angle. She looked at the coffee, and then at him, and then at the tablet. What time is it? 9:40. What is it I need to see? He turned the tablet and pushed it across the table toward her. She got out of the chair, stiff, the accumulated damage of the previous night inventorying itself in her joints, and came to the table and sat across from him and looked at the screen. It was a photograph. Surveillance quality, taken from above and at a distance, mildly grainy in the way of images pulled from cameras not meant for close study. It showed the exterior of the Silver Lantern diner. The timestamp in the corner read 7:22 a.m. A little over 2 hours ago. Standing in the parking lot of the Silver Lantern, talking to a man she didn't recognize, was Gus, her manager, heavy-set, smelling of onions, with his eternal grievances about his ex-wife. Gus, who'd shorted her hours and forgotten her tips and consistently referred to her as the girl in conversations she wasn't meant to overhear. Gus, who had a key to everything in that diner and knew the layout of every room and knew exactly which shift she worked and exactly when she would be alone at 3 in the morning with the last customer gone and the overnight quiet settling in. The man Gus was talking to in the photograph was Luca Fiore. She sat with that for a long moment. The tablet screen was cool and flat, and the image didn't change, no matter how long she looked at it. "How long?" she asked. "We don't know. We're working backward through the timeline. He knew I was there. He knew I'd be alone. He knew the layout of the kitchen, which exits." She stopped. She picked up the coffee and set it back down without drinking from it. "He told them when to come." That's what the image suggests. Who does Gus work for? We're developing that. What we know is that Luca Fiore went to the diner at 7:22 this morning and met with your manager, and that conversation lasted 9 minutes, and at the end of it, Gus made 2 phone calls. To who? First call was outgoing, 6 minutes, to a number we're tracing. Second call was incoming, 3 minutes. Reeves folded his hands on the table. We believe the incoming call was from the organization that hired the hit on Mr. Caruso. The room was very quiet. The rain had stopped sometime while she was sleeping, and the warehouse district outside the window was doing its morning business. Trucks, distant machinery, the hollow echoes of large empty spaces. Ordinary sounds. Sounds that had nothing to do with the photograph on the screen in front of her. Gus knew who Dante Caruso was, she said. Yes. He set the table. He made sure I'd be there alone. He made sure the timing was right. She stopped. Something else was assembling itself in the back of her mind, slower and colder than the rest. The night Caruso came in. Midnight. How did he pick the silver lantern? Reeves was watching her. It wasn't random, she said. Caruso doesn't go to random diners at midnight. Someone told him it was safe. Someone he trusted told him the silver lantern was a place nobody would look. She looked up from the tablet. Did Gus also work for Caruso? Worked for people adjacent to Mr. Caruso's organization? Yes. So he sold both sides. It appears that way. She put the tablet down face down on the table. She looked at her hands. The cut on her left palm had dried to a thin, dark line. He put me in that room. Gus put me in that room with 3 professional killers and a wounded man, and he knew exactly what he was doing. Ms. Holloway, 6 years. Her voice was very quiet. I worked for that man for 6 years. I know. He shorted my tips. He forgot my name in front of clients. He called me the girl. She stopped again. She was aware of Reeves watching her, and she was aware that the emotion moving through her right now was the kind she would normally contain, the kind she had a long-practiced habit of taking somewhere private to deal with. But the habit was failing her because the thing underneath it was too large and too recent and too specific. He could have told them to pick any shift, any night. He picked mine. You were convenient. You were isolated. You had no family in the city, no one who'd ask immediate questions if something happened to you overnight at work. I was nobody. To them, Reeves said. Yes. She sat with that for a moment, then she said, Where is he now? Reeves didn't answer right away. Where's Gus right now? Contained, Reeves said. Temporarily. What does that mean? It means he's not going anywhere until we decide what to do with him. I want to talk to him. That's not... I want to talk to him. She looked at Reeves directly, and whatever he saw in her face made him stop completing the sentence he'd been building. You brought me here. You told me this is about managing the situation. I am the situation. I want to talk to the man who put me in that room. A pause. A long one. 30 minutes, Reeves said. I'll be present. Fine. Gus was in a room 2 floors below. She didn't know what the room normally was. Storage, maybe, or some auxiliary function of whatever this building had originally been built to house. It had been cleared out except for a table and 2 chairs and a single overhead light that gave everything a jaundiced quality, turning skin yellow and shadow deep. Gus was in one of the chairs, and his hands were on the table, and he looked like a man who had been sitting in a bad situation long enough that he'd stopped actively being scared and had moved into a kind of numb resignation, which was worse in some ways. He looked up when she came in. Whatever he'd been expecting, it wasn't her. She saw it happen in his face. The recognition, and then the specific horror that follows recognition when the person you're recognizing is the person you decided didn't matter. Marin. Her name in his mouth sounded strange. He'd called her the girl for 6 years, and her name in his voice had the quality of a word in a language he didn't actually speak. She sat down across from him. She put her hands flat on the table the same way his were flat on the table, and she looked at him and she didn't say anything. He looked away first. I didn't think you'd... He stopped. Finish that sentence. I didn't think it would go the way it went. What did you think would happen? They said it would be quick. They said nobody except the target. He stopped again, swallowed. They told me you wouldn't be involved, that you'd be in the kitchen when it happened, or on a break, or... I'm never on a break at 3 a.m., Gus. You've had my schedule for 6 years. He looked at the table. I know. You knew I'd be there. I needed the money. The words came out flat and stupid, the way true things sometimes did when they were also terrible. I owe people. I've owed them for a long time, and they were going to... He rubbed the back of his neck with one hand, the familiar gesture, the one she'd seen 1,000 times when he was about to explain something he'd done wrong and frame it as someone else's fault. I didn't have a choice. Don't say that. Marin, don't you say that to me. Her voice was still quiet. She was keeping it there deliberately, holding it at a volume that required more control than shouting would have. You had every choice. You made the one that was easiest for you, and you put me in a room with 3 men who were going to kill everyone in it. You made that choice, and you're going to sit there and tell me you didn't have one. He didn't answer. Who called you? She said. I don't know the name. Who called you? She said again. A number. Untraceable. They told me when Caruso would come in. They told me to make sure you were on shift. They said... His voice broke slightly, reformed. They said there was 50,000 in it, and all the debt forgiven. And Luca this morning. He flinched. He came to tell me it had gone wrong, that someone had interfered. He wanted to know... The flinch deepened into something structural. He wanted to know your full name, your address. The room's yellow light sat on everything without mercy. Did you give it to him? Gus looked at his hands. Did you give him my address, Gus? They already knew it, he said. They already had it from the HR files. He stopped. He looked up, and there were tears on his face, which she hadn't expected, though she wasn't sure why. Betrayal apparently didn't exempt you from your own feelings about what you'd done. I just confirmed it. She stood up from the chair. She walked to the door, and Reeves was there, and she said to him, without looking back at Gus, without raising her voice, He gave them my home address. We know, Reeves said quietly. We moved on your apartment 40 minutes ago. She turned and looked at him. 3 men, Reeves said, already positioned, waiting for you to come home. She stood in the doorway between the yellow room and the dimmer corridor, and the information rearranged itself in her chest in a way that physical pain sometimes did, not all at once, but in stages, each stage worse than the last. 3 men at her apartment with the deadbolt that stuck in humid weather, and the window in the kitchen that didn't close all the way, and the neighbor Mrs. Petrakis, who walked her dog at 7 every morning directly past Marin's door. Mrs. Petrakis, she said, already contacted. She's been moved. And the 3 men at my apartment? Reeves's face was neutral in the way of someone choosing neutrality carefully. They're aware now that the location is compromised. They'll withdraw. Or reposition. Yes. She leaned her shoulder against the doorframe and looked at the ceiling of the corridor and breathed through what was happening in her chest. Gus was making a sound behind her, not crying exactly, more like a man trying not to cry and failing at the architecture of it, the sounds escaping around the edges of the control he was trying to maintain. She didn't look back at him. Luca Fiore, she said to Reeves. Where is he? We have a location, probable. We're confirming. When you confirm it, I want to know. Ms. Holloway, I want to know, she said. Reeves looked at her for a long moment with that assessing face, that face that was always running numbers. Whatever numbers he ran this time came out differently than before. She could see it in the slight adjustment of his posture, the half-degree shift that meant he'd updated his model and the update had moved her into a different category. We'll let you know, he said. She pushed off the door frame and walked down the corridor, and the full weight of the morning came down on her shoulders like weather. Her apartment was a crime scene she'd never been inside. Her job was a trap that had been built around her over 6 years by a man she'd made coffee for every morning. Her name was in the mouth of a wounded assassin who had every incentive in the world to use it. She thought about her father at the range. November air, cold enough that her breath had been visible, his hands on her shoulders correcting her stance. Lower, he'd said, feet wider. The ground is the only thing that doesn't move, so you start from the ground. She stopped in the middle of the corridor. She stood there and found the ground under her feet, and she breathed. And in the room behind her, she heard Dante Caruso's voice for the first time since the warehouse, steady, low, giving orders to someone on a phone. And she understood with a clarity that felt almost physical that everything she'd been before last night, the invisible waitress, the quiet girl who didn't make waves, the woman nobody saw, was not coming back. She could mourn that later. Right now there was only the ground under her feet, and Luca Fiore somewhere in the city with her name in his mouth, and a choice assembling itself in front of her that was not really a choice at all. Because the woman who'd stood behind the counter and thought about running had already made the only decision that mattered. She just hadn't known yet what it was going to cost her to finish it. The storm arrived at 9 p.m. Not the gradual kind that builds itself politely over hours, giving the city time to adjust. This one came in off the lake like something that had been holding a grudge, fast and violent, turning the streets into black mirrors and the wind into a physical thing that leaned against you and pushed. By 9:15, the rain was coming down in sheets so thick the streetlights blurred into smears of yellow, and the Silver Lantern's neon sign, freshly repaired by Reeves's people, threw its red light in fractured patterns across the wet parking lot. Marin had been back inside the diner for 40 minutes. It had not been her idea. It had been the only idea that made sense, which was a different thing entirely, and the distinction mattered to her even if it didn't change the outcome. Reeves had confirmed Luca Fiore's location at 6 p.m., a safe house 11 blocks northeast of the Silver Lantern, a building registered to a shell company with paperwork clean enough to take a casual look, but not a thorough one. 12 men, his contact said. Maybe more. Armed, organized, and operating under orders to finish what the previous night had started. Dante's response had been simple. We go to them. Marin's response had been simpler. They'll come here first. She'd explained it in the conference room on the 3rd floor of the warehouse building with Reeves and 2 of his senior people, and Dante sitting across the table with his shoulder freshly sutured and his face still carrying the concrete pallor of the previous night. And she'd explained it the way her father had taught her to explain a problem at a shooting range. Start with what you know, work toward what you don't, and don't pretend the gap between them is smaller than it is. What she knew. Luca Fiore had seen her face in the diner. He'd gotten her address from Gus. He'd already sent 3 men to her apartment and pulled them back when the location was burned. He was not going to send men to a location she wasn't at. He was going to send men to the location she was known to be at, her workplace, the place she'd defended the previous night, the place that was now publicly documented as being under Caruso's protection. The Silver Lantern was the bait whether she was in it or not. The question was whether she was in it as prey or as something else. Dante had looked at her across the table for a long moment when she finished. Reeves had started to say something about asset protection and operational parameters, and she'd watched Dante's hand come up slightly from the table, barely an inch, just enough, and Reeves had stopped. What do you need? Dante had asked her. She'd told him. Now she stood behind the counter of the Silver Lantern at 9:22 p.m. and listened to the stormwork on the windows and did the thing her father had taught her to do before anything that mattered. She made herself slow down, not stop. Stopping was for people who had somewhere safe to be. She made herself slow the internal clock, the one that wanted to run at panic speed and bring it down to something she could use. The diner looked almost normal. The bullet holes in the booths had been patched overnight. Not beautifully, but adequately. The vinyl repairs slightly too new and too even compared to the years of patching around them. The shattered coffee mugs had been replaced. The counter had been cleaned. The neon sign was working properly for the first time in months, the letter L in lantern, holding steady instead of blinking its distress signal. It looked almost normal except for the things she'd added. The front lights were rigged to the same switch as before, but now they were wired to a second switch at the kitchen entrance as well, so she could kill the room from either end. The fire suppression system, an aging overhead sprinkler grid that the previous owner had installed in 1987 and that had never once been tested in her 6 years here, had been examined by one of Reeves's people that afternoon and declared functional. The trigger panel was in the kitchen, a red handle on the wall beside the range that she'd walked past 1,000 times without thinking about it. She'd thought about it now. She'd thought about what a room full of water and chaos and zero visibility did to people who came in expecting a straightforward operation. The kitchen had been rearranged, nothing dramatic, the kind of rearrangement that looked like end-of-day cleanup to someone who didn't know the room, but that subtly changed the geometry, pushed the choke points, altered the angles. The cast iron pans were at shoulder height now on the rack above the prep table. The industrial oil container that usually sat beside the range had been moved to the floor just inside the kitchen door on the right side, exactly where someone moving fast through that door in the dark would find it with their shin. She'd thought about every inch of the silver lantern in a way she never had in 6 years of working it, and what she'd found was that she knew it better than anyone who was coming for her tonight, and that knowledge was the only advantage she had, and she intended to use every fraction of it. Reeves's people were outside, not visible. If they were visible, they were useless. 3 positions around the perimeter, 1 on the roof of the hardware store across the street, 2 more in vehicles parked at angles that covered the lot's 2 exits. Dante was with them. She'd told him she didn't want him inside, and he'd looked at her with the expression of a man who was accustomed to making that kind of decision rather than receiving it, and then he'd nodded. "If it goes wrong," he'd said, "I know where the exits are." Marin? Her name in his voice was different from her name in Gus's voice. She didn't examine why. "Don't be a hero." "I'm a waitress," she said. "I'm just working my shift." She'd turned away before she could see what his face did with that. Now she poured herself coffee she wasn't going to drink, and stood at the counter and watched the rain fall on the parking lot and waited. The diner was empty. Reeves had made sure of that. A handwritten closed for private event sign in the window, visible enough to turn away the genuine overnight customers without drawing attention. The coffee was hot, and smelled the way coffee always smelled in here, like something reliable, and she held the cup in both hands and let the warmth work on her palms, and she breathed. 10:47. She heard them before she saw them, not because they were loud, because they weren't, but because the rain changed quality slightly when bodies moved through it, the way sound does when the space it travels through is differently occupied. It was subtle. She might have missed it on any other night. She set the coffee cup down without making a sound, 3 from the front. She could see shapes through the fogged windows. Not clearly, just the displacement of rain and light that meant mass and motion. Moving with the controlled spacing she recognized from the previous night, the professional geometry of people who had done this before, which meant at least one of them had tactical experience, which meant the others would be orienting on that person's positioning and following his lead. She went left along the counter, low, fast. The button for the front lights was under the register and she found it without looking, the muscle memory of 1,000 shifts, and the diner went dark. Then she went through the kitchen door. The kitchen light stayed on. She needed to see in here. What she didn't need was the silhouette in the pass-through window. She moved immediately out of the line of sight from the dining room and pressed against the wall beside the range and listened. The front door opened. She heard it over the rain, the specific sound of the silver lantern's door, slightly swollen from weather, that required an extra push to clear the frame. She'd heard it 10,000 times. She'd never been glad to hear it until she understood what it meant. They were inside. She heard movement, controlled, spread out, exactly what she'd expected. She heard one of them say something in a voice too low to parse and heard the others adjust, the small sounds of tactical repositioning. They were sweeping the front room, They'd find it empty, and then they'd come for the kitchen. She had approximately 90 seconds. She reached for the fire suppression trigger. She pulled it. The system made a sound she'd never heard before. A deep mechanical thunk from somewhere in the ceiling, like a massive lock disengaging. And then the sprinklers opened up, and the noise was extraordinary, a sustained rushing roar that filled every space in the building simultaneously. And from the dining room she heard voices cut sharp and startled, and the clatter of someone's weapon hitting a table. She moved. Through the kitchen, low and fast along the right wall, away from the door, toward the dry goods storage room at the back. The sprinklers were in the kitchen too, soaking everything, and the floor went slick in seconds, the water sheeting off the stainless prep tables and pooling around the base of the range. She kept her feet under her through memory rather than sight. Knowing the kitchen wasn't about seeing it right now. It was about having walked it enough times that the body knew where to go. Storage room door. She went through and pulled it shut behind her. The storage room wasn't on the main sprinkler grid. It was dry and dark, and she pressed her back against the shelving and pulled a short breath and assessed. Through the closed door, she could hear the diner's interior, the continuous roar of the suppression system, voices raised over it trying to coordinate. At least one person already down, judging from the sound of impact and swearing she'd caught at the moment she moved out of the kitchen. The oil container by the door, exactly where she'd placed it, one already compromised. However many remained. She felt along the shelving by touch. Large cans, dry goods, and bags. The solid cylinder of a heavy flashlight she'd put here that afternoon, and not told Reeves about, because she hadn't wanted the argument. She found it and clicked it on, keeping the beam low and tight. Against the back wall of the storage room was the panel she'd found that afternoon with Reeves's man. The building's original electrical sub-panel, predating the diner by at least 20 years, controlling circuits that no longer made complete sense, but that included, on the far right, a breaker marked Kitchen XT in faded marker. Kitchen exterior. The lights above the back alley exit. She flipped the breaker off. The alley went dark. Whoever Reeves had covering the back of the building would see it and know what it meant. She was going out the back, and the people coming in through the front were between her and the exit, which meant the exterior team needed to be ready. She moved back to the storage room door and listened. The sprinkler system was still running. She could hear water cascading in the kitchen, off the prep tables, off the pans, off the floor in a continuous sheet. She could hear voices, but fewer than she'd expected and more controlled than she'd hoped. These people were regrouping. They'd taken the suppression system as a surprise and they'd absorbed it, and they were reconsolidating, which meant they were experienced enough to adapt, and she needed to stop giving them time to do it. She came out of the storage room fast and low, and the kitchen was a different place in the dark with the water coming down. Every surface reflecting differently, the sound consuming everything, her footing uncertain in the 2 inches of water accumulating on the floor. She moved toward the kitchen door to the dining room and stopped just inside it and listened. 2 people, maybe 3, moving in the dining room. The water in there was lighter. The suppression system was less dense in the front of the house, the older piping not delivering the same volume, and she could hear their feet in it, the particular sound of boots moving carefully on a wet floor. She pushed the kitchen door an inch, and the dining room came into her sightline in pieces. The wet booze, the shimmer of water on the floor catching the ambient light through the windows, the slow red pulse of the neon sign outside throwing everything in and out of visibility. 2 men, both moving toward the kitchen. She let the door swing open and moved right behind the counter while they were still orienting on the motion of the door. She went down behind the counter and moved along it toward the register end and came up in a gap in the countertop. And the nearest man was 6 feet away and had his weapon up and tracking toward where she'd been, not where she was. She swung the flashlight like a baton. It caught him across the forearm, the arm with the gun, and the impact ran up into her shoulder and his weapon discharged into the ceiling, the shot enormous in the enclosed wet space. And she was already moving past him because she didn't have the mass to take him in a sustained grapple, and she knew it. She needed movement. She needed the geometry working for her. The second man fired and the shot went into the counter where she'd been a half-second before, and she was behind booth 3 now, on the floor, the wet vinyl of the seat back above her head, the water on the linoleum soaking into her knees and palms. She heard the first man, the one she'd hit, swear with real feeling and heard him moving toward her position, and she moved again before he arrived, sliding to the far end of the booth and coming around its base into the next aisle and rising to a crouch. The second man was at the counter. The first was between the booths, moving along the aisle she'd just vacated. The neon cycled through its pulse, and in the red light she saw the first man's profile. And he was looking away from her, and she crossed the aisle in 2 steps and put everything she had behind the heel of her hand into the base of his skull. He went down. The floor came up to meet him, and he stopped moving. She stood over him with water coming down on her from the ceiling and her breathing in ragged pieces and her right hand screaming from the impact, and she thought, in the half second before she had to move again, that's going to hurt tomorrow. The second man had heard it. She could tell from the quality of his stillness, the held breath kind, the kind that comes before something fast. She moved laterally, away from where she'd been, and he fired at the sound of her feet, and the shot went into the booth, where she hadn't been standing, and she was already behind the counter again, and the coffee urns were in front of her, and she grabbed the nearest one. Shish, full, just brewed 30 minutes ago. She'd brewed it out of sheer habit at 9 p.m., because that's what you did at 9 p.m. in the Silver Lantern. And she came up over the counter and threw the whole urn. It hit him in the chest. Not the contents, the urn itself, 12 pounds of stainless steel traveling fast, and he went backward into the booth behind him, and the table edge took him across the lower spine, and the sound he made wasn't the sound of a man who was going to get up quickly. She came around the counter. The dining room held 2 men down. She was soaking wet, and her right hand was swelling, and she had a cut on her shin she didn't remember getting, and she was standing in 2 inches of water in the middle of the Silver Lantern diner at 11:03 p.m., in a rainstorm with the sprinkler system still running, and somewhere in this building there were more of them, because 12 men didn't come through one door. The back. She turned, and the kitchen door was already opening. 3 men coming through, and the one in front was Luca Fiore. She recognized his face, even through the water and the dark. The face that had smiled at her across the counter the previous night, like she was furniture. The face she'd shot in the lower left side and apparently not put down firmly enough, because here he was, moving with a slight hitch in his stride that said the wound was real and being ignored through the specific discipline of someone who'd decided pain was a management problem rather than an obstacle. His eyes found her in the dark the way a predator's do, immediately, without searching. "There she is," he said. The same words as the night before, the same tone, as though no time had passed, as though the intervening hours of her apartment and the warehouse and Gus's tearful confession and everything it had cost her to get to this moment were simply the gap between acts, a formality. She was out of weapons. She was out of coffee urns. She was out of darkness. He had a tactical light on his weapon, and it was on her, pinning her to the spot at the end of the counter like something mounted. "You've been busy," Luca said. He was moving forward, slowly, the 2 men behind him fanning slightly to the sides. "2 of mine down out front, 1 in the kitchen. He'll walk again someday. You work fast for a waitress." "That's what everyone keeps getting wrong," Marin said. "I'm not fast, I just don't stop." "You're going to stop tonight." "Maybe." "No, maybe." He came to a halt 8 feet from her. The tactical light held steady. Behind him, his 2 men had their weapons up, and their faces were professional blanks. "You cost me something last night. Not just the job. Something personal." "Your pride," she said. "My face." A flat pause. "Left side, 3 stitches. It'll scar." The light moved over her, slow and deliberate, the way a man surveys something he's decided belongs to him. "I've been thinking about you all day, wondering about a girl who does what you did last night, and then just..." He gestured at the diner with his free hand, goes back to pouring coffee. "It's a good diner." It was. Something shifted in his expression. "Where's Caruso?" "Not here." "Where?" "If I knew, I wouldn't tell you. Since I don't know, it saves us both the conversation." He looked at her for a long moment in the white tactical light, and the water came down around them both, and the neon outside pulsed its red through the fogged windows. And she looked back at him and thought about her father at the range in November and the cold air and the ground under her feet. And she thought about 6 years of invisible overnight shifts and Gus's voice saying the girl and the cut on her palm from the night before and the 3 men who'd been waiting for her at her apartment and what it meant to have a home that was now somewhere other people could decide to point violence at. She thought about all of it in the 3 seconds she had while Luca was still deciding how to continue the conversation. And what she thought was, the ground is still there and he doesn't know the kitchen. Last chance, Luca said. Where is Caruso? She looked over his shoulder. Luca turned, half a turn, the instinct of a man who hears something in a person's eyes before he hears it in the room. And that half-second of redirected attention was everything she'd been waiting for, and she went left, away from the light, toward the kitchen door, moving faster than she had any right to move on a wet floor with a swollen hand and a cut on her shin, because speed wasn't about condition. Speed was about commitment, and she was committed in a way that didn't leave room for anything else. She hit the kitchen door and went through, and one of the men fired, and the shot went into the door frame above her head. And she was in the kitchen, and the kitchen was dark and wet, and she knew every inch of it, and they didn't. And she heard Luca's voice behind her say, "Go, both of you, now." She reached the back door and hit the crash bar, and the door came open, and the alley outside was dark and full of rain, and for a half-second, that was the longest half-second she'd ever lived through, she couldn't see anything. Just the rain and the dark and the wet brick of the building opposite. Then a hand came out of the dark and caught her arm and pulled her sideways, and Dante Caruso's voice said, close to her ear, "I told you I'd be outside." "You were supposed to stay back." "I did stay back." A pause. "Until I heard the shots." From inside the silver lantern she could hear movement, boots on the kitchen floor, Luca's men coming through, and then from the front of the building and from the alley's far entrance, the sounds of Reeves's exterior team moving in, the sounds of a perimeter closing, the sounds of the arithmetic of the evening finally resolving toward its answer. She pulled free of Dante's grip. She turned and faced the back door of the silver lantern, and she was soaking wet, and her right hand was swollen, and the rain was coming down on her face, and she looked at the door and thought about Luca Fiore on the other side of it, with his 3 stitches and his personal grievance and the dozen men he'd brought to finish something that she'd started by reaching for a gun off the floor in the dark. Inside the building, she heard a crash, a shout, multiple voices. She heard Reeves's people. She heard Luca's voice. Not words, just the sound, high and sharp and totally unlike the flat professional calm he'd carried through the whole evening. Then a shot, then 2 more, then silence of a different quality than before. She stood in the rain and breathed and waited, and Dante stood beside her and said nothing. And she was grateful for the nothing. And the rain came down on the Silver Lantern Diner, and the neon sign blinked its red through the windows. And somewhere inside, a man with a scar on his face was learning what it cost to underestimate the same person twice. The back door opened. Reeves stood in the frame, water dripping off the edge of his jacket. He looked at Marin. He looked at the state of her, the cut, the swollen hand, the soaking clothes. And then he looked at Dante. "It's done," he said. She looked past him into the kitchen. She could see the kitchen's wet floor and the overturned oil container and the scattered cast iron pans, and at the far end, just inside the kitchen door from the dining room, a shape on the floor that she didn't look at for more than half a second. "Luca?" she said. Reeves shook his head. She stood with that for a moment. She didn't know what to do with it. The information sat in her chest in a complicated way that wasn't relief and wasn't grief and wasn't satisfaction, but was the thing that lives in the spaces between all of those, the thing that has no clean name. "The others?" she said. 3 in custody, 2 fled north. We'll find them." He paused. "The rest won't be a problem." She nodded. She looked at the silver lantern, at the water still running through the cracked open back door, the sprinkler system still pouring its delayed salvation across every surface. At the neon sign throwing its red through the fogged windows, steady now, not blinking, the repaired letter holding firm. Dante put a hand on her shoulder, carefully, given his own injury, the gesture requiring visible effort, and said, "It's over." She looked at him. He believed it. She could see it in his face, the specific relief of a man who has survived something that should have killed him and has filed it accordingly. She almost said, "Is it?" She almost said, "There are more of them and they know my name, and Gus is in a room somewhere, and the diner has a bullet hole in the kitchen door frame, and I have nowhere to sleep tonight that doesn't have someone else's damage in it." She almost said all of it. Instead, she looked at the back door of the Silver Lantern and at the rain coming down on the parking lot and the alley and the whole wet, ordinary city around them, and she said, "I need to go turn off the sprinklers before this place floods completely." And she went back inside. The sprinkler handle was exactly where she'd left it, red, mounted to the wall beside the range, the paint on it chipped from years of nobody ever needing to touch it. She gripped it with her good hand, the left one, the one without the swelling, and pushed it back to its closed position, and the roar of the suppression system wound itself down over about 15 seconds, the pressure dropping, the flow from the ceiling going from sheets to streams to drips to a slow, irregular ticking that echoed through the kitchen like a clock deciding whether to keep running. She stood in the silence that followed. Her boots were soaked through. She could feel water in her socks, between her toes, a cold and intimate discomfort that was somehow more real than anything else from the last hour. The kitchen floor had 2 inches of standing water across most of its surface, maybe 3 near the drain in the center that had clogged months ago and that she'd put in a maintenance request about, and Gus had never fixed. Of course he hadn't fixed it. She stood in Gus's unfixed drain water and looked at the kitchen she'd worked in for 6 years and thought about all the things she hadn't known about the place. She thought she knew completely. Reeves came in behind her. She heard his boots in the water. "We need to clear the building," he said. "I know. There's a debrief. Tonight, if you're up to it. Tomorrow, if you're not. Tonight." She turned around. "I want to know everything." He looked at her swollen right hand, at the cut on her shin that had bled through her sock, at her face, which she could only imagine from the outside, but which she suspected looked like a face that had been through something it was still processing. "We can... tonight," she said again. He nodded once. She went to the prep table and sat on it. Just sat on the edge of it, with her feet in the water and her hands in her lap, taking 60 seconds that she was not going to apologize for. The kitchen smelled like wet metal and coffee, and the specific scorched nothing smell of the suppression system's discharge. Through the pass-through window, she could see the dining room. Reeves's people moving through it with that particular efficiency of hers, every motion purposeful and without wasted effort, the physical grammar of people for whom aftermath was part of the job. She looked at the shape she'd not looked at before. Just inside the kitchen door. Luca Fiore was face down on the wet floor with his arms at wrong angles, the tactical light still attached to his weapon, which had come to rest against the base of the prep table. The light was still on, pointing at nothing in particular. She looked at him for a long moment. At the 3 stitches on the left side of his face, visible even from this distance, and at the stillness, the complete and final stillness. And she thought, he came back. He came back with 12 men and a personal grievance, and he came back to the place that had already beaten him once, because men like that couldn't accept the first answer. She understood it, in the abstract way you can understand something that is also alien to your experience. The not accepting. The returning. She just understood it from the other side of the calculation. One of Reeves's men came and took the tactical light and turned it off, and the kitchen got darker. She appreciated that, though she couldn't have said why. She got off the prep table. She went through the kitchen door into the dining room, and she walked the length of it, booth by booth, the way she'd walked at 10,000 mornings, the end of shift check, looking for forgotten cups and napkins and belongings, the ordinary inventory of an ordinary night. The boots of Reeves's people moved around her, and she moved around them, and neither interrupted the other. Booth 1, a shattered coffee mug she'd missed in the sprinkler aftermath, the pieces floating in the water on the floor. Booth 3, the one she'd used for cover, now with a fresh gouge across the vinyl seat back from something she didn't want to identify. Booth 7, where the sad accountant and the woman who deserved better had sat on 100 overnight shifts, the table slightly off level, the same as always, a postcard of normality in the middle of everything. She stopped at the counter. She went behind it. She got a coffee cup, a clean one, from the rack under the register, and she put it on the counter in front of her, and she filled it from the urn that was still standing upright, the one she hadn't thrown. She didn't know if it was still hot. She didn't check. She just filled the cup and put the urn down and put both hands around the cup, and stood behind the counter of the Silver Lantern and breathed. Dante came in through the front door at 11:40. She heard the door. the extra push to clear the swollen frame, and looked up. He looked worse than he had in the warehouse, the hours since the surgery having reminded his body about the damage with the particular delayed emphasis of serious injury. He was moving carefully, each step deliberate, the kind of carefulness that had nothing to do with caution and everything to do with the body issuing non-negotiable terms. He had Reeves beside him, and behind Reeves 2 more men, but he walked to the counter and sat on a stool, and the others fell back, and it was just the 2 of them on either side of the counter, the same as it had been at the beginning. She put a coffee cup in front of him and filled it. He looked at the cup. He looked at his own hands around it. "How's the hand?" "Swollen." "Broken?" "I don't think so." She flexed it slightly, testing. The pain was specific and centered, not the diffuse, deep ache of a break. "Bruised. Probably bruised." "You should have it looked at." "I will." "Tonight." "Tomorrow." She looked at him. "Tonight I need the debrief." He was quiet for a moment, his hands around the coffee cup, the steam coming off it in the cool post-storm air. Someone had opened the front door fully at some point, and the rain-clean night air was moving through the diner, and it smelled like the city after a storm. Concrete and wet leaves, and the particular freshness that didn't last, that was already starting to fade back into the ordinary smell of the city as you knew it. "The organization that hired the hit," she said. "Reeves mentioned them. Are they finished?" "Their people are finished." He paused. "Organizations don't finish. They restructure." "Will they come back?" "Not soon." He turned the coffee cup in his hands. "Word travels in that world. Word of what happened here last night and tonight. It travels fast and it changes calculations. People like that do a cost-benefit every time they target someone. The cost of coming at me went up last night. The cost went up again tonight. Because of me. Because of what you did." He looked at her directly. "There's a difference. What you did can't be hired, can't be trained in the usual way. You have it or you don't, and most people who think they have it find out they don't the first time it's actually tested." A pause. "You've been tested twice in 24 hours. I'm aware. I'm not flattering you. I'm explaining why the calculation changes." She looked at the counter, at the ring her coffee cup had left on the surface. "Reeves said Gus was working for people adjacent to your organization. What does that mean, adjacent?" Dante was quiet for a moment. The specific quality of the quiet, the way he gathered it around a piece of information before deciding what to do with it, was something she'd noticed before and was noticing again. "There are people who do business with my family," he said, "not inside the organization, around it. The way small businesses cluster around a larger economic center, they exist because we exist. They profit because we profit, but they're not accountable to us, and we don't protect them the same way." He set the coffee cup down. "Gus took a contract from our enemies using access he'd developed through proximity to our operations. He sold information that was worth nothing until it was also dangerous." "He sold me." "Effectively, yes." She thought about Gus in the yellow room, the tears on his face that she still hadn't fully decided what to do with. She thought about his hands on the table. Thick hands, the hands of someone who'd worked physical jobs before the diner, with the particular roughness of a person who'd been working since they were young. She'd noticed his hands 100 times over 6 years, without ever thinking about them as belonging to someone with a history that could produce a choice like the one he'd made. "What happens to him?" she asked. "That's being handled." "By who?" "By my people." She looked at Dante. She held the look and let it do its work. He met it without deflection, which she'd come to understand was characteristic of him. He didn't look away from things, a quality that could be mistaken for openness, but was actually something more like a refusal to pretend. "I'm not going to tell you he'll be treated gently," Dante said. "I'm also not going to tell you he'll be treated in a way that I wouldn't be willing to describe to you directly. He gave information that resulted in people coming to kill you. That has a consequence. The consequence is proportionate, and it doesn't include anything I'd be ashamed to say out loud." He paused. "What it does include is him never working in a position of access or trust near anyone connected to my operation again, and a conversation with the people who contracted him that makes clear that he was not authorized to do what he did and is not under our protection. That conversation has its own consequences for him, beyond what we impose. She thought about that. She thought about 6 years of shorted tips and forgotten names and the girl and the unfixed drain in the kitchen floor, and she thought about the specific combination of smallness and proximity that had made Gus the kind of man who could be bought for $50,000 and the forgiveness of a debt. She thought about how long he'd been sitting in debt without telling anyone, and the way debt could make a person's peripheral vision narrow until the only thing visible was the solution in front of them, regardless of who it cost. She didn't forgive him. She wasn't built for forgiveness that fast. But she put him in a category she could hold at a reasonable distance, the category of people who had done her real harm from a position of real weakness. And she decided that was probably the only category that was going to make any sense of him without costing her more than she could afford. "The debrief," she said. They moved to the back booth, booth 7, the sad accountant's booth, and Reeves joined them with a tablet and a folder, and for the next 2 hours she went through everything, every detail, starting from midnight when Dante came in, moving through every decision and position and improvised weapon and moment of cover, all the way through to the sprinkler handle. Reeves asked questions that were precise and non-judgmental, the questions of someone building a complete record, and she answered them all with the same precision, because she'd found that talking through it in sequence was doing something useful to the way the night was sitting inside her, organizing it, filing it into something the mind could store rather than something it had to keep processing indefinitely. Dante sat beside her through it and didn't speak except once, when Reeves asked about the decision to take the gun off the floor rather than go for the exit, and she started to answer and Dante said, "She was closer to it than the exit. Simple, accurate." She looked at him, and he was looking at Reeves, and she thought, he was watching me from the floor of that booth, and he understood every decision I made in real time. That was a strange thing to sit with. When the debrief was finished, Reeves closed the folder and looked at her and said, "You should know that 2 of the men in custody tonight have indicated they want to make arrangements. Cooperation for consideration. We'll know more in the next 24 hours about what they have to offer and whether any of it changes the broader picture." "Does it change anything for me?" "In the short term, no. In the medium term, possibly yes." He paused. "You should stay away from your apartment for a few days. We'll arrange housing." "And my job?" The 3 of them looked at each other. "About that," Dante said. 2 weeks later, on a Wednesday morning in early November, Maren Holloway unlocked the front door of the Silver Lantern Diner for the first time as its owner. The ownership had been transferred without her knowledge or consent, through a holding company that Reeves's people had set up with the specific architectural elegance of arrangements designed to be questioned by no one and traced by fewer. She'd found out about it the same way she found out about most things connected to Dante Caruso, through Reeves, in a matter-of-fact voice, presenting information rather than asking permission, and then waiting to see what she did with it. What she'd done was sit with it for a day and a half and then call Reeves back and tell him that she wanted to put her own name on the deed, not a holding company, her name. He'd been quiet for a moment and then said he'd arrange it. She turned the key in the lock and pushed through the door, the extra push, the swollen frame, and she thought briefly about whether she should finally have that repaired and decided not yet. And she stepped into the Silver Lantern and stood in it and let it be what it was. The shattered windows had been replaced. The glass was new, the frames repainted in a shade that matched the original close enough that you wouldn't notice unless you'd spent 6 years looking at the original. The bullet holes in the booths were gone, repaired with new vinyl in colors that actually matched, not the layered tape archaeology of the previous repairs, but proper work done by someone who'd taken the time. The ceiling tiles above the counter had been replaced with ones that weren't yellowed, and the contrast with the older tiles around them was going to bother her until she had the whole ceiling done, which she was already planning. The neon sign above the entrance was on. Silver Lantern, all letters lit, steady, and even. She could see it through the front windows, throwing its light into the morning street, and it looked the way it must have looked when the place was new, before years of deferred maintenance had taken letters and their reliability. The coffee machine had been replaced. She stood in front of it for a moment. The new one was stainless and clean and capable looking, and she understood that it had been chosen to match the spirit of the original without being a replica of its flaws. She appreciated this more than she could have easily explained. She filled the reservoir, measured the grounds, started the first batch of the morning, and the machine made a sound nothing like the old machine. Quieter, more confident, without the 40-minute throat-clearing complaint. And she stood and watched it work. She tied her apron on. She did her opening prep, the same motions, in the same order that she'd done for 6 years. Syrup dispensers topped off, cream in the refrigerated unit under the counter, menus wiped down and stacked, the glass of pens by the register. The small things that added up to a place being ready for people. The first customer came in at 6:58. Not a regular, someone she didn't recognize. A woman in her 30s in a delivery uniform looking for coffee and something fast before a route. Marin poured the coffee and took the order and brought the food and refilled the cup without being asked. And the woman left a $5 tip on a $6 order and didn't look up from her phone long enough to notice anything particular about the person serving her. Marin put the $5 in the tip jar that now had her name on the bottom of it, written in marker by her own hand. The morning filled in around her. Regulars came back. The Silver Lantern's loyal constituency of night shift workers ending their shifts and early risers starting theirs. The pair of retired men who came every morning and argued about things they'd been arguing about for years. The young woman from the insurance office down the block who always ordered the same thing and seemed almost offended when Marin had it ready before she finished asking for it. They had no idea what had happened here. She served them coffee and watched the morning light come through the new windows at an angle that was different from the old glass. Cleaner, less filtered, making the interior brighter than she was used to, which she was going to have to adjust to. And she thought about what Dante had said the night everything happened, in the booth with his shoulder bleeding through his expensive jacket. After tonight, home is going to mean something different than it did yesterday. He'd been right. She just hadn't known yet what different was going to mean. Different meant that the kitchen door had a new weight to it that she felt every time she went through it. Different meant that the corner booth in the back had a quality she was aware of the way you're aware of a piece of furniture that's been moved. The room looked right, but the muscle memory kept going to where it used to be. Different meant that she knew exactly where the light switch was, and exactly what the fire suppression handle felt like in a wet grip, and exactly how sound moved through the building in the dark. And that knowledge was not going away, was not something she could unlearn, and she was still deciding whether that was a burden or a kind of gift. At 11:15, a man came in and sat at the counter. She didn't recognize him. Mid-30s, compact and watchful, with the quality of someone who'd been in a number of rooms where the quality of attention mattered, and had learned to project a different kind. He ordered black coffee and apple pie, and he ate 2 bites of the pie. She refilled his coffee without asking. He looked up at her. "You're Marin Holloway," he said. "That's what the name tag says." "I heard a story," he said, "about this place, about a week ago." People tell stories. This one was specific. He turned the coffee cup in his hands, the same motion, she noticed, as Dante. The gesture of someone doing something with their hands while their mind was doing something else. Said a woman worked here alone overnight and 3 professionals came through that door and she put them all down. Sounds like a lot. Said she did it with a coffee pot and whatever she could find in the kitchen. "This is a diner," Marin said. "There's always something in the kitchen." He looked at her for a long moment. She held the look the way she'd learned to hold things, evenly, without leaning into it or away from it. He had the look of a man who'd come with a specific purpose and was recalibrating it against the reality in front of him, and she recognized this process because she'd watched it happen in Reeves's face and in the faces of the men he'd brought to the diner that first night. The slow revision of an initial assessment in the face of contradicting evidence. "I work for people," the man said. "People who are adjacent to certain situations. They ask me to come and make an offer." "I'm not interested in offers." "You haven't heard it." "I don't need to hear it." She picked up the coffee pot and refilled his cup and set the pot back on the warmer. "I run a diner. I work the morning shift 6 days a week. I serve coffee and food to people who want coffee and food. That's the offer I have." He looked at her. He looked around the Silver Lantern, at the new glass, the new vinyl, the ceiling tiles that didn't quite match the older ones around them, at the clean counter and the full tip jar and the morning regulars occupying their usual booths with their usual arguments and their usual comfortable habits. "People are going to keep coming," he said. Not a threat, an observation. People who want to know, who want to meet the woman who, I know, she said. They'll come, and they'll sit where you're sitting, and they'll order what you ordered, and they'll get coffee and pie. She looked at him steadily. And they'll leave the same way you're going to leave, with a story that doesn't go the way they expected. The man looked at her for a long, measuring moment. Then he picked up his coffee and drank it, and it was a real drink, not a gesture. He was actually drinking the coffee, and after a moment he said, "This is good coffee." "New machine," she said. "Still working out the grind?" He put the cup down. He put 2 20s on the counter for a $6 order and didn't wait for change. He got up from the stool and he walked to the door, and at the door he paused, one hand on the frame, half turned back. "The people I work for," he said, "they wanted you to know that what happened here, what you did, it didn't go unnoticed. In certain circles your name now carries something." "I didn't do it for certain circles." "No," he said. "That's what they noticed." He opened the door. "Good coffee," he said again, and he left. She watched him cross the parking lot and get into an unmarked car and pull out onto the street and disappear. She stood behind the counter, and the morning continued around her, the retired men resuming their argument, someone's newspaper rustling, the sound of the coffee machine doing its work. Dante came in at noon. She saw him through the window first, standing in the parking lot in a coat that wasn't as expensive as the suit had been. His shoulder carried differently than it had been even a week ago, the healing making incremental progress in the reluctant way of serious injuries. He stood in the parking lot and looked at the sign for a moment. The neon wasn't on in daylight, but the sign itself was there. The painted letters clear and even, silver lantern, with no letters missing or dim. He came inside and sat at the counter. She poured him coffee without asking. He drank it. "How's the shoulder?" she said. "There are words my doctor uses. I don't remember them." He paused. "It works. Mostly. Mostly. Sufficiently." He turned the cup. "How's the hand?" She showed him. The swelling had gone down over the 2 weeks, leaving a bruise that was in the yellow-green phase of its healing, the body's cleanup operation in its final stages. She could close a full grip now, with only a moderate complaint from the second and third knuckles. "I have a proposition," he said. "I heard one of those this morning already. Mine is different." "They all say that." He looked at her steadily. "I want to offer you a position. Not in my organization. I know your answer to that, and I respect it. A consultancy, essentially. You'd continue running the diner. On a small number of specific occasions, I'd ask your opinion on a specific kind of problem." "What kind?" "The kind that involves a building someone knows well and someone else doesn't. The kind that involves a person being underestimated and what to do with that. The kind—" He stopped, considered, "that involves knowing the room better than the people coming into it." She looked at him. She thought about the man who'd come that morning with his $40 and his offer and his observation about certain circles. She thought about Reeves and his debrief and the folder and the 2 weeks of arrangements and counter-arrangements that had occupied the city's invisible machinery since the night of the storm. She thought about what it meant to have a skill that people could use, and whether having that skill meant you were obligated to use it, or just that you had options you hadn't had before. She thought about her father at the range in November. "Occasionally," she said. "That's all I'm asking." "And the diner stays what it is. The diner stays exactly what it is." She looked at the silver lantern, her silver lantern now, with her name on the deed and her name on the tip jar and her 6 years of knowing every creak and angle and shortcut in its bones. And she thought about what it meant for a place like this to survive things it wasn't supposed to survive. The closing, the neglect, the neon sign going letter by letter, the violence that had come through its door and been answered with whatever was at hand and whatever she knew about the space she was standing in. Places didn't survive that. Mostly they didn't. They got bought and redeveloped, or they just slowly stopped being what they were, the identity draining out of them like heat from a room with a broken window. This one had held. She put her hand, the bruised one, the one that still ached in cold weather and probably always would, on the counter, flat on the surface. She felt the counter under it, the slight give of the laminate where it had been repaired years ago under a previous owner, the cool solidity below that, the absolute stillness of something that had been in the same place for decades and intended to remain. Occasionally, she said again. Occasionally, Dante agreed. She refilled his coffee. Outside, through the new glass windows, the city moved through its ordinary noon. The delivery trucks and the pedestrians and the insurance office workers going to and from their lunches. The unremarkable ordinary texture of a weekday in a neighborhood that didn't make the news. The sun was out, the first clean sun since the storm, and it came through the new glass at an angle that was brighter than the old glass had allowed, filling the silver lantern with a kind of light it hadn't had before, making the repaired booths look newer than they were, and the counter look cleaner than any counter had a right to look. In the weeks that followed, people did come. Not many, and not obviously, nothing that would look like anything from the outside. A man who sat in the corner booth and ate breakfast and left. A woman who came twice, and the second time slipped a card across the counter with a number on it and nothing else, and Marin put it in her apron pocket and later looked at it once and put it in a drawer. Someone who asked specific questions about the ventilation system and the kitchen layout, framed his questions from a potential investor, and she answered them with the patient precision of someone who knew the room very well and understood the actual question being asked. She never left the silver lantern for any of it. They came to her. She decided early on that this was the terms, and she held to them without explaining why. Because the reason was simple enough that saying it out loud felt redundant. She'd already established what happened when people came to her in a room she knew better than they did. The word in certain circles, which reached her in fragments, through Reeves, through the occasional visitor, through the specific way people behaved when they sat down at her counter, was that the woman at the silver lantern had defeated professional killers twice in 24 hours, using a coffee pot in the dark and whatever else was at hand. They expected something when they met her. They expected the architecture of the story. Something harder, something visibly marked, something that would make the story make sense against the face delivering it. They found a woman in her late 20s with dark hair pinned back and a small bruise fading from her right hand, pouring coffee with a patience that had nothing to do with submissiveness and everything to do with having nothing to prove to the person sitting across the counter from her. The retired men who argued every morning never knew her name, not the whole version of it, though one of them had started calling her by her first name sometime in the third year, and she'd never corrected it. The woman from the insurance office never once looked up from her phone long enough to notice that the person serving her had changed in any fundamental way. The overnight truckers and the insomniacs and the night shift nurses came and went the same as always, ordered the same things, left the same tips, carried their own weights in and out the door. One Thursday afternoon in late November, Marin sat at the counter on the customer side, something she'd never done in 6 years, and drank a cup of her own coffee during the quiet between the lunch rush and the dinner prep. The diner was empty. The sun was low, coming through the west-facing windows at an angle that made everything amber, the kind of November light that existed for maybe 40 minutes before it was gone. She sat with the cup and looked at the silver lantern from the other side of the counter. She thought about her father, not the way she'd thought about him during the worst of it, in fragments, in the middle of decisions, his voice supplying instruction at moments when instruction was needed. She thought about him the way you think about someone when the emergency is over and the person has been dead long enough that the thinking can be about who they were rather than only about what they gave you. He'd been a man with limitations. He'd been difficult in specific ways that she'd spent years navigating and had never fully named because naming them felt disloyal, and she thought now that it wasn't disloyal to name them, it was just accurate. He'd been a man who loved her in the ways he knew how and taught her the things he knew how to teach, and left her with the rest to figure out, which was both the most and least he could have done. She thought he would have had something dry to say about the last 2 weeks, something that didn't give her too much credit, and didn't give too little, something that acknowledged the facts without ornamenting them. She thought he would have said, "You may do with what you had. That's what you do." She drank the last of her coffee. She went back behind the counter. At 3:14 in the afternoon, not morning, afternoon, a different 3:14 from the one this had all started at, a young woman came in with a backpack and sat at the counter and ordered coffee and a piece of apple pie. She had the look of someone new to the neighborhood, still calibrating herself to it, not yet sure which places were going to be her places. She looked around the silver lantern with the assessing eyes of someone deciding. Marin brought the coffee and the pie. The young woman looked at her. Is this place always open this late? We close at 10, Marin said. Reopen at 5. Late night hours? Overnight, yeah. Midnight to 5. The woman nodded and looked at the pie and tried it. Her face did the thing that faces do when something is better than expected. A small, involuntary settling, the body giving its honest opinion before the mind has a chance to edit it. This is really good. Baked this morning, Marin said. We bake on site now. I might come back for the overnight shift. The woman looked around again. It feels, I don't know, safe. Marin looked at her, at the ordinary face of someone who just wanted a place to be for a while that felt like it wasn't going to surprise her badly. It is, Marin said. She said it the way you say things you mean without needing to explain them. The afternoon sun came through the new glass and lay across the counter in a stripe of amber light, and the silver lantern held it, the same way it held everything. Not perfectly, not without damage, but completely, with the particular stubbornness of places that have survived what they weren't supposed to survive, and have decided, without ceremony or announcement, to remain. Marin refilled the young woman's coffee without being asked. She went back to work. End.